Chapter 15 of The Adventures of a Nature Guide by Enos Mills. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. American schools have, as a matter of fact, failed to train the great mass of the children for successful earning of a livelihood in the American world of today, and at the same time they have failed, for the most part, to inspire the children with the tastes, ambitions, and aspirations which would guide them to a sensible and enjoyable use of their leisure. Dr. Charles W. Eliot. Chapter 15. Harriet, Little Mountain Climber. Little Harriet Peters, a 6-year-old friend of mine, was listening intently to the comments of the climbers whom I had just guided to the summit of Long's Peak. They were describing their trip to a number of others. Presently Harriet turned to me and asked what birds and animals lived on the top of this high peak of the Rockies. Often I had been asked what could be seen from the top of the peak. Many people were curious about the size of the summit. Most interested climbers wanted to know how long it took to go up and back. But never before had anyone asked what lived there. When the mountain climbing discussion ended, this little girl very soberly asked if I would sometime take her to the top of Long's Peak. "Yes," I replied, "just as soon as we feel that you can go up and back easily. It is a long, steep climb." Then she wanted to know, "Is it uphill all the way?" I had early become interested in Harriet. She was so alert, so quiet, and always so cheerful and wide awake. She often went off alone to climb the nearby trails or for a ride on her burro. Of course she enjoyed playing with the other children. Though she had never been to school, she had learned to read, and every day out of doors she appeared to be learning new things. She was constantly surprising me by asking a lively and original question, which showed that she saw many of the interesting things around her and wondered about them. "How do beavers sharpen their teeth?" she asked one day. We had returned a few hours before from a visit to a beaver colony, where we had seen a number of large dead trees whose hard wood showed the marks of the beavers' gnawing. Harriet really wanted to get on top of Long's Peak. She was curiously, thoughtfully interested in the things to be seen on the summit of this rocky, snowy landmark that towered so grandly 14,255 feet into the sky. Although I had never taken anyone so young, I was eager to go up with her. One autumn day, just after Harriet was 8 years of age, we went up. We started off on horseback. The trail begins in a mountain valley 9,000 feet above sea level. The peak rises into the sky 1 mile higher. After galloping a short distance, we walked our ponies so that they might breathe for a stretch before taking another gallop. Harriet wanted to know why it was we slowed down when we might have galloped to the steeper part of the trail. Why I tightened the saddle cinches also called for an explanation. A person who walks with a loose shoe receives a blistered foot, and a horse ridden with a loose saddle receives a blistered back, I told her. Most of the time Harriet was silent, observing and thoughtful, but occasionally she asked a definite question about the things nearby. She was interested in the new and unusual objects along the way. The lodgepole pine, perhaps because of its name, caused her to ask many questions. She wanted to know if Arkansas pine, such trees as she saw in her Arkansas home, also lived in the Rocky Mountains. She asked the name of the trees growing in groups near the lively brook along which we were riding. These were young balsam fir trees, and the purple cones that stood upon the topmost limbs not far above her head attracted her attention. She had remembered hearing that up the mountainside There were species of trees that did not live in the valley, and that at the timberline, where the forest edge is furthest up the mountain, lived still other kinds of trees. While traveling westward in a cañon, I pointed out the scattered limber pines growing on the north wall in the sun, and the dense, tall growth of Engelmann spruce on the shady opposite wall. She was interested that these two kinds of trees were living so close together, and yet one species kept on the warmer, drier side of the cañon, and the other on the cooler, moister slope, while the firs grew only along the stream. We saw a number of chipmunks eating the scarlet berries of the low-growing kinnikinick. They allowed us to ride close to them, and appeared so tame that Harriet asked, "If we had time to stop, would they let me play with them like the chipmunks around your cabin?" The night before had been stormy on the upper mountain slopes. Harriet was surprised that there were a few inches of snow here and none down below. She was riding ahead that she might better see the fresh tracks of the birds and animals in the trail. There were many rabbit tracks, clean cut and splashed. It looked as though they had had a game. Suddenly my pony bumped into Harriet's, who had stopped and turned to ask, "Have some barefooted children and their mother been up the trail this morning?" A line of big tracks came out of the woods on the left and followed the trail up the mountain. How strangely like the tracks of barefooted children and an old person, the tracks of a mother bear and two cubs. Slowly, quietly, not even whispering, we rode up the mountain hoping to see them. We were scolded by a pine squirrel for moving so cautiously. We saw where the bears had eaten blueberries in the snow, but there were no bears. At timberline, 11,000 feet above sea level, all of the trees were small, yet they did not look like young trees, but appeared aged, storm-beaten, and strange. Many of them really were hundreds of years old, yet so tiny that Harriet could reach to the top of them. Many were not so tall as she. "My doll would like to climb them, but they are too small for me to climb," she said. We tied our ponies and rambled along this strange edge of the forest. There were pines, firs, spruces, dwarfed birch and aspen, and Arctic willow. "Why," Harriet asked, "do these little people live up here on the cold mountain side?" Magpies, camp birds, and Clark's nutcrackers were numerous, having a nutting picnic. All were having great fun, but the nutcrackers were getting most of the nuts, pecking holes in the pine cones and busily eating the large, almost ripened fruit, and calling noisily. One of the camp birds alighted upon Harriet's shoulder, curious to know if she had something for him to eat. They are perhaps the most sociable and the best known birds in the western mountains. About 9 o'clock the sun came out and the snow began to melt. The remainder of the day was calm and warm. No air stirred. On the Arctic moorlands above the timberline we watched carefully, hoping to see the bighorn. We did not see even the track of one, but we came upon a flock of ptarmigan. These birds had already laid off most of their light brown summer clothes and were dressed in almost pure white. The last 3 miles of the 7 steep, winding miles to the summit are entirely above the limits of tree growth, among rocky crags and old snowfields, with most of the trail over either solid or broken rock. On Boulder Field, 5 miles from our starting point, we tied our ponies to rocks in the shelter of large boulders and continued upward on foot. Harriet was a sure-footed climber. As we started across this mile stretch of glacial moraine, I told her that expert mountaineers travel slowly, always look before making a step, and stop for talking and looking around. Occasionally we rested, and sometimes we lay down upon a flat boulder and thoroughly relaxed. At about 13,000 feet, while we were thus resting, there came a strange chirpy squeak. Harriet heard it repeated a number of times before asking what it was. Presently a little animal, resembling a rabbit somewhat, but more nearly like a guinea pig, ran in front of us, carrying in its mouth a few blades of coarse grass and one or two tiny Arctic plants. It was a mountain coney. Was he squealing because something bit his ears off? Harriet asked. The coney's short ears do appear as though clipped. I told her that the coney is called the haymaker of the heights. Each autumn he gathers small haycocks of plants and stores them among the boulders for his winter food. Why doesn't he go down the mountain and live by the brook where there is more hay? Was another question that I could not answer. About 1,000 feet below the top of the peak we turned aside for a drink from a tiny spring, the last water on the way up. Here we lingered several minutes. Harriet gathered a double handful of snow and carried it to the spring that she might send more water down the Mississippi to New Orleans. Then of the wet snow she made a dam on the rocks where the water flowed from the spring. Leaving this place we did steep rock climbing over a few hundred feet to the Narrows. In places Harriet walked in front of me, but most of the time she was behind and always close. By listening carefully I could tell that all was well with her without looking back. At no time were we roped together. In a few places I helped her, but most of the time she walked alone. A few snowdrifts and ice piles remain on the head and shoulders of the peak all summer. The upper 2,000 feet is almost solid rock. There are cracks, ledges, and shattered places, with a pinnacle and shattered rock around its base. Here and there was a beauty spot, a tiny bed of soil covered with grass and flowers in the midst of the rocky barrenness. From the Narrows, a little below the summit, we saw two eagles soaring and circling about in the air 2,000 or 3,000 feet above us. A few times their shadows dashed by us. The Narrows is a ledge, a shelf-like stretch of the trail on the edge of a precipice. There is no banister here, but one is needed. Many grown people have stopped at this point, but Harriet walked across without saying a word. Up the home stretch, the last climb to the top, the slope is extremely steep and the rock solid. Here many people call out "safety first" and go up on all fours, but Harriet, who was in front of me, walked up, swinging her arms and humming softly to herself. We arrived at the summit of the peak a little after 12 o'clock, 5 hours from the time we started. The broken summit surface is nearly level and strewn with slabs and angular chunks of pink granite, from sand and coarse gravel up to blocks several feet across. The instant we stopped on the top, I said to Harriet, "Now you are here, what do you think of it?" She stood for nearly a minute looking around without saying a word, and then asked, "Where did all the rocks come from?" Harriet was surprised to find the top so large. There was just about room to give all the players in a baseball game a place to stand, with the batter, first baseman, and outfielders all standing on the edge. We walked around the top, keeping close to the edge. In most places it dropped off steeply for 100 feet. The east side is a perpendicular wall more than 1,000 feet high. There were many cracked and loose stones on the edge. Many were almost ready to fall overboard, as numerous others had already done. Plainly, the top of the peak had once been much larger. Just as we were sitting down to eat our lunch, Harriet asked, "How big was the top once?" We sat in a safe place near the edge of a precipice where we could look down into Chasm Lake, a glacier-made basin 2,000 feet below us. The water, though clear, appeared as green as any emerald ink you have ever seen. A half-tamed groundhog that in summer lived upon the summit came forth to have scraps of our lunch. A flock of rosy finches alighted near us. A hummingbird flew over without stopping. A number of butterflies circled about in the calm, sunny air. Harriet asked if there were always the same animals on the summit. I told her I had seen bighorn sheep tracks and mountain lion tracks there. Just once, when I was up with another little girl, I had seen a cottontail rabbit on the top, but I could not understand how he came to be there. Bluebirds, robins, ptarmigan, eagles, and weasels sometimes come to the summit. We looked at the many-colored lichens upon the rocks and at the green leaves of the purple primrose and the stalks of the yellow avens. They were growing in little patches of sand between rock slabs. Harriet asked where the plants and the mountain-top birds came from. I told her that a number of the same plants and animals were found in the far north around the Arctic Circle. At one time, many thousand years before, the Ice King had sent his glaciers a few thousand miles from the north, driving Arctic plants down on the moving ice and ptarmigan in front of it. These plants and birds had made their home on the mountain tops and remained after the ice melted away. Harriet's aunt had told her that the Alps are much older and snowier than the Rocky Mountains. No one lives as high in the Alps as the mountain valley where we were living. Timberline, the forest edge, is at 6,500 feet there, and no plants or birds live above the altitude of 9,000 feet. As we stood for a moment before beginning the descent, Harriet turned and looked silently at the far distant, magnificent views to the north, south, east, and west. Not a question was asked, and I have often wondered what impression they made upon her. After having a little more than an hour on the top of the peak, we started slowly homeward. When a little below the altitude of 12,000 feet, we dismounted and searched among the boulders for the columbine. Luckily, we found a beautiful specimen, with its silver and blue petals waving on a slender stalk that stood several inches higher than Harriet's head. The columbine is the state flower of Colorado, having been selected by a majority vote of the school children, and is mentioned for our national flower. Harriet looked again and again at the strange little trees at Timberline and watched eagerly for the bears. We talked about the things we had seen. She asked many questions about the trips other climbers had made, and I told her of experiences on rainy days, on snowy days, and on wintry days. She was most interested in my moonlight climbs and wished she might sometime go up at night. Of the 250 odd trips which I have made as a guide to the summit of this great old peak, the trip with Harriet is the one I like best to recall. And I am sure, too, should Harriet live 70 years, she will remember the day of her successful climb to the summit of Long's Peak. This climb, as I remember, was in September 1905. Some years later, I heard that Harriet was graduated from a girls' college in Texas. I often wonder what has become of her. End of chapter 15.